This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
We got through a point where it seemed to me that a lot of CFOs were delegating their operational responsibilities. I don't see that as possible anymore, given the tightness and difficulty of the situation.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Bill Woodson. Thanks for joining us. I am honored to be joined by Ken Kaufman of Kaufman Hall, now officially part of Vizient. And it's so great to have his perspectives on what's so important right now, which is the state of healthcare finance. This is going to be a great discussion, and we're going to do it in two parts. Ken, thanks so much for joining us. We're moving into this next phase of the post-pandemic recovery. My colleague Brian and I follow the numbers that Kaufman Hall puts out on operating margins. What's the new normal? Should we expect things to stabilize? Are they improving? As you guys put out, 40% of health systems or hospitals lose money. What's your take?
2022 was a terrible year for hospitals. It was the worst year since 2008. We had median operating margins across almost the entire year of 2022 and into a little bit of 2023 were negative. So we hadn't seen that in a very long time. Things started stabilizing in 2023, and they've gotten better in 2024 as hospitals have reacted to the situation. Obviously, many hospitals have worked really hard to take out costs. There's been a lot of layoffs across hospitals across the country. If you just looked straight out at the numbers, you would see overall improvement, but that isn't actually what it looks like. What we're actually seeing is moving to the tails statistically. It's hard to tell. We roughly say 25%. Don't hold us to that. We don't know whether it's 20 or 30 or whatever, but some proportion of those hospitals in the country are actually recovering very well. And those are the organizations that are pulling the median hospital operating margins up in 2024. And some of those organizations are actually doing extremely well financially. But then when we dove into the numbers more deeply, we discovered that still roughly 40% of hospitals were losing money. Those were the organizations that never came out of 2022 okay. And I would guess that that's the new normal, that COVID was a very hard moment. And it probably takes a little time and perspective to figure out how hard. Many of the mid-sized independent community hospitals across the country were not doing very well going into COVID in 2019. And they got hit much harder than academic medical centers and large systems and that kind of thing. Is that the new normal? I would guess that the movement, what we would call fat tails in terms of those organizations that are financially successful and those fat tails of organizations that are going to struggle on an ongoing basis, that looks like what we're going to be dealing with for a while.
You guys recently put out a column on more the operating model and efficiency, and you've made analogies to airlines. Should we be more focused on the operating expense side, or is it really just being smarter about revenue growth?
I don't think there's any organizations that can solve it on one side or the other. Hospitals generally, when things got a little touchy, they would focus on cost, as everybody knows. Hospitals have had a love-hate relationship to costs. I think everybody recognizes that. When times are pretty good, costs tend to move up. And then when hospitals discover that they're break-even or losing money, then they dive into the cost side. What we've discovered that coming out of COVID, there's a lot of organizations that can't solve this from a cost perspective anymore, especially if they've been through a number of cost reductions. So if they've done cost reductions 3 or 4 times since 2016, they're getting to the point where they're not in fat anymore, they're in muscle and bone, and they don't really 100% know what to do. Let's say that an organization does a financial plan and discovers that it has a gap of $80 million. In other words, in order for it to get back to financial equilibrium, it has to find a way to adjust $80 million in the organization. To suggest that that can be done from cost in a lot of places is unrealistic. So what we've started saying is, why don't you look really hard at your revenue situation? How much revenue are you leaving on the table? How much do the payers owe you that you're actually not collecting or not getting? And if that turns out to be $30 or $40 million, then on the cost side, you only have to do 40. You don't have to do 80. This is a totally understanding your operating situation and dealing with both sides of the operating statement, both revenue and expenses.
Just in the past week, we've seen several systems move into standoff with their major payer. Is that something you think we're going to see more of? And we wonder, do we recommend that? Is that where we're headed?
Nobody really wants to do that. It's fraught with risk. It also creates a public relations issue that you never really know how that's going to turn out. You would think that given the overall situation that the public and politicians would be sympathetic to the hospitals in those situations, but we've seen time and time again that that doesn't turn out to be the case. There's no doubt that some hospitals across the country need to take a stand right now. They're not getting paid appropriately. They're not. They're saying to themselves, we've done almost everything we can from a cost perspective. Or if we do more from a cost perspective, we're going to harm the clinical quality and service capability of this organization. So we've got to get more revenue. And we've been through this drill now 3 or 4 times and we never win. Now you're seeing hospitals take more extreme positions on this situation. And they're going to some of their top payers and saying, look, we're going to get this right or we're not going to do this anymore.
Given what we've just talked about, what does that say for the role, the current role, the future role of the CFO? Is it more operational, more strategic? How are their jobs changing?
All of the above. Good CFOs are both operational and strategic. That's why it's very hard to find good CFOs. This is a job that's transitioned in a significant way. In many large organizations, the CFO actually has emerged as the second most important executive in the C-suite after the CEO. The CFO situation has bounced around so much that organizations, for a while, they wanted operational CFOs, and then they decided they needed strategic CFOs. But for a CFO to be really effective, they definitely have to be operational. They can't delegate that. We got through a point where it seemed to me that a lot of CFOs were delegating their operational responsibilities. I don't see that as possible anymore, given the tightness and difficulty of the situation. At the same time, many of the strategic decisions that are being made in complex healthcare organizations are very financially oriented, and the CFO has to have a strong grasp of that strategic situation and be able to contribute to the conversation and decision-making process, both at the C-suite level and at the board level.
Let's go back to the balance sheet. Let's say you're in a pretty healthy situation and you have to deploy capital. Maybe you have a reason or a means to grow. And we're fortunate enough, as are you, to work in markets like Columbus and Dallas and Nashville. What's the best way to deploy capital right now?
If you've seen one capital deployment situation, you've seen one capital deployment situation. So it really depends on where you are in that capital cycle. A lot of commentators say, well, don't be spending that much money on depreciable assets anymore because that's probably not going to be where you are. But some organizations have no choice. If you're in the position where your bed towers and your outpatient centers are not what they need to be from a competitive point of view, then you're going to have to go in and spend the capital there. It's ridiculous to say, well, don't do that if that's the competitive situation that you find yourself in. On the other hand, it's the softer costs that are going to be demanding a lot of capital at this point. The whole notion of having the right technology and the right software to create portals to make it easy for your patients to navigate around your system, that is absolutely one of the most important things that's on the docket for most healthcare centers across the country. We still have a situation where patients complain constantly about they can't get appointments or they can't figure out how to use your system. Or, of course, the huge one is that they do finally get diagnosed and then they get a referral and they can't make the referral work. If we continue to expose our patient population to these kinds of impossible navigations around your system, then you shouldn't be surprised when they go looking for somewhere else to go because patients just get like, I can't do this anymore. The doctor has described this problem. I need to see a specialist, and then maybe I need to see another specialist. Why can't this be easy? Why is it that I have 4 months or 6 months waiting time and I'm scared and not going to deal with it? People want that portal to look like Amazon, and there aren't very many hospitals around the country whose portal does look like Amazon. That's going to be very expensive, but it's an essentiality right now.
2 years ago, you brought up the colonoscopy story in the Chicago area. I belong to One Medical. I had to get in for a colonoscopy, and they have a preferred relationship. I got in within a week. So do you think we're going to be buying access? We're going to pay for access with like Amazon Prime Healthcare?
There's lots of people who are totally willing to buy access. Of course, there will be other populations who can't afford it or for whom that's a foreign concept. The point you bring up, Bill, is sort of a little tricky. Buying access sounds good, but it's going to be good for certain portions of the population and not good for other portions. You're also dealing with the inequality issue, and buying access could make that inequality issue worse. You get in a week for the colonoscopy, somebody else waits 6 months. You have colon cancer, you get treated right away. That other person has colon cancer, they don't get treated for 6 months, and then you can see where the outcomes are going. Probably will go in that direction, given the capitalistic approach that we tend to take to problems in the United States, but that approach is not all good.
It's fraud. I agree. Let's change directions here. You've talked for decades now about M&A in healthcare, and then more recently in one of your columns about the new era of partnerships. How are you leaning right now where we consolidate, bring things together?
Well, coming out of COVID, M&A is fascinating. What we've got right now, and I actually just did write a blog just a few weeks ago on this, that if you look at the macroeconomics of the hospital system, you would be expecting to see a lot of M&A right now. We talked about in the first question that 40% of hospitals are losing money, and then you maybe have 25% of the hospitals that are doing actually exceptionally well. MBA 101, right? Here's the exam question. Here's the macroeconomic circumstances of an industry. Please tell me in your answer what you would expect to happen. The answer is what MBA 101 should write to the answer to that question is there will be accelerated M&A because there are hospitals with significant resources and abilities to capitalize on inorganic expansion. And there's many hospitals who need to be acquired in order to continue to provide reasonable services to their community. That's not happening. The regulatory process has gotten extremely difficult. So we have these two unforgiving issues that are meeting each other. One, from a capitalistic perspective, we would expect a lot of M&A right now, but from a regulatory perspective, we can't execute on that. Something's got to break here. We'll just have to see how that works through.
Let's probe a little more on that. In other words, if you're a struggling small hospital, rural hospital, you want to be part of something bigger to give you access to EMR and workforce and other resources that are so essential to run it. Give me your perspective on rural. We do get this question quite a bit.
What do rural hospitals lack? They lack resources. What do they not lack? They don't lack problems. They've got problems everywhere. They've got small markets. In many cases, because of the whole change in inpatient, outpatient, they don't have enough inpatients anymore. And even if they're exchanging outpatient work for inpatient work, that's a revenue problem. So they had a revenue problem before, and now they have a bigger revenue problem. They have a lot of trouble maintaining services. The biggest service they have trouble maintaining right now is obstetrics. With the regulations and everything, if you're only delivering 200 babies a year, you got to let it go. And they are letting it go. So as a result, we're getting obstetric deserts across the country, which is not a good thing from a policy perspective. What we really need is highly evolved systems that both have urban, suburban, and rural clinical, and that these highly evolved systems will go into rural areas, be able to consolidate those rural areas, and provide sufficient resources to allow high quality care in that situation, and also recruit the kind of manpower and womanpower that's necessary that rural hospitals are having a really hard time obtaining that.
You and I have talked about this in the past. The growing of healthcare systems hasn't necessarily improved quality, but let's take the other side. The payer concentration dominance far outstrips what the providers have. Where does this tug of war end? It feels like on the provider side, we're at a disadvantage.
Well, insurers are not regulated in the same way that hospitals are. Hospitals are generally regulated by the FTC. Insurers are regulated by the Justice Department General. The Justice Department has its hands full with so many other things. The FTC is a single regulatory agency. The FTC has a single philosophical approach to regulation. If they get into a situation where they think any kind of consolidation or partnership will raise prices, then they oppose that. That's their approach. That has made it extremely difficult for hospitals to consolidate. At the same time, the large insurers have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. United Healthcare, within the next 2 to 3 years, will be one of the largest corporations in America by revenue size. They're actually not that far behind Walmart anymore. Any business professor worth his salt would tell you not a fair fight, and it isn't, obviously.
two more areas to cover here. So let's talk about private equity. Brian and I cover this quite a bit, and where private equity is playing and not playing in healthcare right now. What's your take? Is it helpful? Is it disruptive? Is it adding competition? What's your view on it?
From a political perspective, private equity is seen as a large evil in the healthcare situation. Senator Markey and the other senator from Massachusetts are very opposed to private equity participating in the American healthcare system, and they talk about it all the time. It's really now come back up to the fore because of the Stewart situation in Massachusetts, which was not a private equity failure, but was started by private equity, so it's being seen as a private equity failure. That's probably a more complex conversation as to who's really to blame for that situation. Private equity tends to accelerate growth, and when it's used properly, it's been a very successful component of the American economy over the last 25 to 30 years. However, when it's not used properly, when it's used with too much leverage and it's not done thoughtfully, then it tends to contribute to failures that are very apparent and sometimes impact the ability of the healthcare system to deliver appropriate care. Over the last number of years, we've seen both. I'm not that critical. I participated and experienced private equity myself and in an extremely successful way. And I know I've worked with many private equity guys who are extremely smart, and they make very thoughtful and good decisions, and they help grow our economy. But when it's not done that way, failures tend to be larger and more dangerous than failures of traditional corporate organizations. And Stewart is a great example right now.
This actually connects to something Brian and I delve into, which is the employed medical group. Private equity has been playing in that space as well with specialists for many years now. What's your take on the hospital employed medical group? Let's keep it aside from AMCs for the moment and how this plays out. We've read your blogs, of course, and what you've said about this. So what's your take?
In general, it's not working. You'll remember the employed medical group. The whole approach was that we know we're going to have to subsidize these doctors, but we need to, because if we don't subsidize these doctors, then we're going to lose the referrals. And if we lose the referrals, then the whole house of cards begins to fall apart. So we have to take on these subsidies. But what the problem is there was a really complicated financial analysis of how that worked. And the subsidies have gotten larger, and the benefit of the subsidies have gotten smaller at the same time. The philosophy of this situation, as it started out, let's say, 15, 20 years ago, 2008 destroyed so many small medical practices that's when employment really came up, because up until that time, doctors were very reluctant to be employed. But after 2008, they looked at their capital situation. They said, this isn't going to work. And then they all ran to their local hospital to get hired. That's when we got the employment, and that's when people started doing the original analysis. Now we're 16 years, 17 years down the road from that. Reimbursement is deteriorating from the referral and inpatient and outpatient. And so basically the numbers in many instances simply just don't work anymore. I think you'd expect to see hospitals re-examining this whole situation, trying to find a different way of accomplishing the same thing, or in fact beginning to push down on compensation of doctors in order to lower the losses, or come up with different structural approaches to the employment in order to lower the losses as well.
The second part of Ken's discussion with my colleague, Brian Esser, we're going to ask him some questions about the role of primary care, the role of the CFO in healthcare moving forward, alternative revenue, and things that we should be thinking about that we're not. So we're so excited about part 2 of a discussion with Ken. He's provocative. I hope he's challenged your thinking in the first part of this discussion. We're excited for the next one. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at SG2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, SG2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.